All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of it, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we're also taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use the question and answer tab on your interface and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Also, at the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Quantifiable Application Security, Mining the Value of DevSecOps. Our speaker today is Paul Dant, who is the VP of Security Products at Digital.ai. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate your being here.
Thanks, Charlene. It's a pleasure. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about a few things really stemming from DevSecOps. I'm hoping that I'll cover with you aspects of application security, what it really means when we speak of quantifiable application security, and ultimately how it can help your organization both better understand risk and make better, effective use of security product spend. So before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am Paul Dant, VP of Product Management at Digital.ai. In my role here, I oversee the strategy and vision of our security products based on what I understand from the industry, my own experiences, and feedback from customers. I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I got started in the area of security. I've actually been researching various aspects of software security for around 30 years. I got started when I taught myself to code around 1988 or so, and I started publishing computer games in the shareware model. Strangely enough, I was selling in school to my coworkers and, classmates, and one of those classmates who had bought my game actually said, "Hey, my dad was looking at your game, he found your code, I want my money back." And that was my introduction to software piracy and the difficulties in keeping systems, including software, secure. Ever since then, I've been on a journey to better understand these things and help organizations build software the right way, both for security as well as quality, which we know are intertwined and directly correlated. I've overseen security assessments from everything from hospitals to nuclear energy facilities to bank data processing centers. I am very experienced in looking at systems as a whole, identifying clear vulnerabilities, prioritizing them based on the easiest and most impactful to exploit, which of course is exactly how attackers today work. Now, when we talk about cybersecurity, not just application security, but cybersecurity in general, quantifying our success is difficult for a few reasons. Today, our success qualification in cybersecurity is not having a publicly revealed compromise or breach. That's not a really good measure of success, particularly given the risks and the potential disastrous outcomes that we are seeing as these attacks evolve against healthcare facilities, water treatment facilities, as we've recently seen. So when we look at how we're typically trying to evaluate our success, there's a few things. There's measurement. What are we trying to measure? How can we measure it? That's going to drive implementation. How we set up the security controls for the system based on the assets that we're trying to protect. That stems from threat modeling, something that we won't have time to talk about today. I'll probably mention it a few times. And if you're not familiar, if it's not something that you're aware that your organization is doing, I encourage you to look into a threat modeling exercise. Don't necessarily start with any of the complex frameworks like Microsoft or NIST or anything like that. Start with the basics. Understand what it is you're trying to protect who you're trying to protect it from, how they could do something bad to that asset. And then, of course, when we look at a program like this, we can follow through these steps to really try to quantify how well we're doing. Let's take a further look into why we need to be able to do that. It's really no secret that we're not spending wisely in security products, in security strategies. It's clear because of the continued cybersecurity attacks that we're seeing and the elevating consequences of those attacks. If we look at some of the metrics that we are made aware of through research like that performed by PricewaterhouseCoopers, 22% of chief executives believe their risk exposure data is comprehensive enough to inform their decisions. That's a really low number, given that in any organization where we want to be successful in our security efforts, it has to start at the top and go down. If we don't have support for real, true security from the top, we won't be successful. That 22% number tells us why we're continuing to see mounting, elevated cybersecurity attacks. Now, I mentioned measurement, understanding what it is that we need to measure, the notion of KPIs, key performance indicators. We've listed a few examples of KPIs, metrics that we typically see organizations using to determine their level of success, their level of effectiveness in their overall security program. Now, these are just a handful of any number of metrics, of KPIs that we should be tracking to better understand how we're doing. But as you look through these KPIs, even just this handful, how many of these bullet points can we honestly say we have our hands around? Do we have a definitive source for this information? Is it a single source? Does it require inquiries across a number of cross-matrix organizations to even identify one of these things? That's a problem. And what it means is that we don't have the visibility in place, we don't have the reporting mechanisms in place to properly measure KPIs like this. The idea, the fundamental idea behind these metrics is to both improve security from the top down, but also bring about security awareness. It really goes along with that top-down view of security success. An organization's security awareness is critical, especially from the top down. So when we look at measuring and really doing something with this data that we're gathering, as we mentioned, you can't manage what you can't measure. If you don't have the visibility in place, like that handful of KPIs that we looked at on the last slide, if you can't gather that information, track it, measure it appropriately, then we can't manage any of those risks associated with it. So removing the guesswork, using these KPIs, building the visibility of the systems, putting those systems in place to accurately track them is going to deliver value end to end. It's going to improve overall security awareness. It's going to improve security messaging, both internal to your organization, as well as externally. And given that most companies out there, we're seeing digital transformation expedited in so many industries because of the global pandemic and the need for not just remote access, but a move to completely digital services for a lot of industries that have not previously been ready to adapt in that way. They're being forced into this arena. Mobile applications, modern web applications, where we have complex JavaScript applications running within our web browser. When you start pushing these kinds of digital products out there without any understanding of risk, we're asking for trouble. So with those measurements, we can start to envision how we address those risks, which is really the point if you think about it. A security program is all about helping us identify risks and manage risks appropriately. We can use those measurements to do just that. As we do that over time, we can really build a valuable historical concept
All right, guys, looks like we just lost Paul for just a second, but please stay tuned. He is going to be dialing back in. We apologize for the technical difficulty. Hopefully, Paul will be able to get back in very, very quickly and resume his presentation. But while we are waiting for him, just a quick reminder that today's event is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of it, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we are going to be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And you can also, if you have a question at any time during today's presentation, you can submit your question using the question and answer tab and get it on in before we get to the question and answer period. You don't have to wait for that. At any time, you're welcome to submit your question. Paul, are you back? We got you yet?
I am, yes.
All right, great. Well, I will put myself back on mute and you can resume your presentation.
Thanks so much, Charlene, for filling in. My apologies, everyone. Of all things, my phone connection dropped. The things that we deal with technology. So getting back into it, my apologies. What we're really trying to say here with the idea behind properly measuring these metrics is that we can communicate upward how we're doing from a security program perspective, allowing management to make informed decisions, understand and improve cybersecurity efforts, which overall really means allowing top-level management, board of directors to truly understand the risks that our organization faces and the decisions that need to be made, the procedures, the processes that need to be carried out to address them. Now, I mentioned app security earlier in our talk, and I want to dive into that again just very quickly, mainly because it is compromised applications are the present and the future of cybersecurity attacks. The reason for that is that what I would call commoditized vulnerability scanning and management, a lot of organizations are maturing in that respect, which means there's less endpoints with known vulnerabilities for attackers to easily exploit. It still exists for sure, but as we close those things off and attackers search for other attack vectors, applications become a very, very effective target. The reason, as I mentioned before, with digital transformation and it being forced on us, there are so many apps being pushed out there now. Mobile apps, web apps, even IoT devices, apps that are running within automobiles and medical devices. That software in many cases has a level of life or death associated with it if something were to go wrong, including a cyber attack. That's very scary. So we know that attackers are going after apps. Why are they successful? That's what I want to talk about here. So when we look at what an attacker typically is going to do to compromise an app, it's two primary exercises. The first is reverse engineering, simply taking your app off of an iOS or Android device in the case of mobile and using tools, techniques to better understand how it works, what it does, and most importantly, how it's protecting itself and its data. The security controls for securing communication, for data at rest encryption. All of these things can be readily identified by an attacker just by having the skills and looking at the software. We have ways to combat that. In fact, that's a big part of what our application security products at Digital.ai are meant for, is preventing that susceptibility to reverse engineering and tampering. That said, in recent research performed by the IT group, looking at a collection of anonymous financial services applications available in Google Play, public app store, 97% of those applications lacked any protection against what I just described, which means that 97% of those financial services applications can be downloaded, pulled off of the device, and completely disassembled to the point where we understand everything, including how that app is communicating to enterprise infrastructure. That's the scary part, and that's why attackers are going after apps now. We have this extended perimeter of trust, if you will, where now we have these software components that are running on devices. We have no visibility into those devices. We can't manage those devices. They're just simply people's personal mobile devices. But they're running our software on those devices and connecting to our internal systems on those devices. When you really extrapolate that, if an attacker can essentially understand your software and modify it to control how it works, that's a really, really bad recipe. And that's how attackers are succeeding in these massive data breaches, gaining access, unauthorized access to systems that can, in some cases, do really scary things like modify the various components injected into water in a filtration site, which I mentioned earlier, but just one of the more obvious scary aspects of how attackers can understand these apps, make them work for them, and actually gain unauthorized access to systems, sometimes very easily. One reason for that, similar vein in that same research, 25% of those financial services apps were found to contain hard-coded secrets of some sort. Encryption keys, some sort of authentication credential for actually talking to back-end API systems, which is essentially our interface into our organization's enterprise infrastructure. 25% of those apps had the information needed to carry those types of attacks out. When we look specifically at APIs, obviously as a part of digital transformation and the way we are building digital products today in many cases, we're leveraging essentially mobile and web apps that are utilizing microservices, collections of API endpoints that allow us to communicate with that application. 75% of attacks against an organization where we're utilizing some form of credential abuse. Credential stuffing is an interesting attack along these lines. If you've not heard of it, the idea is basically, as an attacker, I've purchased or stolen a large set of user authentication credentials, usernames and passwords that work for a particular site, or were compromised through a phishing campaign, something like that. I'm then able to, if I can figure out how your mobile application authenticates users to your backend systems, then I can essentially automate that process and send it every one of those stolen credential combinations that I have. And what's that going to do? It's going to give me a list of all of those credentials that are valid in that website or that mobile application. It's also going to tell me that I have the correct passwords. Now, that entire list represents a set of accounts that I can easily compromise using that mobile application. 75% of attacks against organizations were using something like that to easily compromise accounts. So when you think about financial services, mobile banking applications, that's really, really scary that an attacker can utilize our own mechanisms, our own systems to determine if our stolen credentials are valid. So we're going to shift gears a little bit here from AppSec and talk about value stream management, particularly how it merges with security and the idea of DevSecOps. So if you're not familiar with value stream management, it really comes down to this. We have these key challenges that are even more pressing now that we are in this midst of digital transformation. So organizations are trying to achieve all of these things, improving agility, driving profitability. What's clear is that our traditional methods haven't really worked. And there's one reason for that. What value stream management is really all about is providing the organization with a platform with the tools necessary to understand how value flows in your organization from ideation all the way to cash when it's been delivered to the customer. We know that that value does not flow through the management hierarchy that is represented in our organization. It takes a very different path, and that path is typically unique for each organization. That's what value stream management is all about. Identifying how those values flow through your value development system and being able to track the right metrics to address these challenges that we've listed here. That's really the core idea behind value stream management.
Okay, it looks like we might have lost him again. I certainly hope that's not the case, but if so, let's go ahead and real quick, just a reminder that if you have a question at any time during today's presentation, you got a question for Paul, please go ahead and use that question and answer tab. And also, we are going to have a drawing at the end of today's webinar for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So, but you got to be in it to win it. So please stick around, and hopefully Paul will be right back, and we'll get him set up again to finish out his presentation. Paul, have you returned to us again?
I should be back, yes.
Okay, all right. I'll put myself back on mute.
I'm very sorry, everyone. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with my phone dropping me, but nevertheless, let's dive back in. So when we look at really what organizations are depending on as far as priorities with value stream management, digital transformation is the top priority for IT leaders, and we understand why. It's been something that's been in play for a long time. So many industries have been moving to digital products, digital interactions with customers, and now it's been pushed even further. But second to that priority is cybersecurity. And what we're really trying to talk about today is how those two things really are intertwined and how much cybersecurity risk is prevalent in the process of digital transformation, particularly when it's being rushed, when we're really needing to drive functionality out to customers quickly without taking the proper steps and precautions to consider risk. So when we look at delivering and protecting business value, we know that the threat landscape constantly evolving. It's keeping all of us on our toes. You can see we brought back this metric about the number of apps not employing appropriate levels of binary protection, going back to the susceptibilities I talked about earlier, reverse engineering and tampering. When we look at some of these other metrics, 38% IT and business professionals are doing an excellent job creating new value for end customers. That's low. 30% of IT and business professionals are measuring the value software development efforts delivered to the business. That's also low. What it means is our methodologies previously have not been working. Our waterfall approach to system design, the idea that value moves it through an organization to customers from the top down, we've been misguided in some ways in falling into sort of that thought process. And it's resulted in a lot of siloing within organizations, particularly development, operations, and security. That's really where our concept of DevSecOps comes into play, and not just bringing those organizations together, but rather merging them into the same value stream, into the same set of processes that are focused on delivering value to customers. So obviously our business goals, we looked at some of the challenges we're trying to solve with value stream management just a couple of minutes ago. They align with most organizations' business goals. We want increased profitability, accelerated innovation to attract more customers. All of these things are objectives that most businesses are striving to achieve. Those often conflict with what we have on the R&D side, application development, delivery goals, actually bringing those values to the customer. There are quality and security related objectives there that, as we've been discussing, are often overlooked when we're tracking KPIs, when we're measuring effectiveness and success in these various programs. So the challenges that have really stemmed from the way we've done things before is a siloing of really critical business functions that leads to very limited visibility across those functions within the organization. A disparate set of metrics that indicate success, when there really is no need for us to be operating in these silos across these different sets and different ideas of success. DevSecOps is all about bringing those things together so that we can truly see across those various critical functions that are responsible for delivering value, what needs to improve. Now, when we bring the idea of security into the concept of value stream management. I've mentioned a couple of times visibility. This is really key when we're looking at understanding both how value is delivered to the customer in value streams, but once it gets out there, how are we sure that that value is maintained, particularly when we're talking about security? How do we make sure that the controls that we put in place to keep our products secure, to deliver quality products, how do we know that those controls, those procedures, mechanisms are working? Visibility is the key. And that's something that we miss quite a bit in the midst of digital transformation, simply because, as I mentioned earlier, we have these mobile applications now that are operating on systems that we just don't have any insight into. So the best way to achieve that is to equip software to gain those insights for you. When we look at the idea of attackers going against mobile and web apps, you may have heard of a number of supply chain attacks that have been reported in the last few years. MageCart is a really interesting one that was really targeting web apps. The entire idea was compromising, say, a source code repository for a very, very commonly used JavaScript library. Even something simple for web UI elements, something that is, in the web sense, linked in to the web application dynamically as it's running. If I can insert some sort of scraping code to lift credentials in JavaScript, if I can compromise a code repo and put that code in there, it will run on any users of my website without their knowledge. And these attacks were successful against organizations like Ticketmaster, British Airways, big names. The challenge here, because of the unique aspect of the supply chain attack, neither the organization nor the user, the customer, knew that their credentials were being stolen from their computer right under their nose. If we have the proper protections in place to address reverse engineering and tampering, that becomes much less of an issue. We can detect that this new code has been injected, and we can first not run it, prevent the attack from being successful, but gain visibility into it. Convey data, convey event data from that helps us better understand the who, what, when, where, why, how elements of incident response. Where is this attempted attack coming from? What did it consist of? All of the things that we would typically run through to better understand it. Now, when you develop that kind of visibility, just like I mentioned earlier in tracking KPIs, over time, you build some very, very valuable historical context that can actually direct the way we adjust our security programs, the way we adjust overall value stream management based on what we're seeing in the real world reported to us by our digital products. Now, to kind of bring together and summarize what we've been talking through as an overall message, value stream management, as I've explained, is critical to understanding, of course, how value moves through an organization. When we bring security into the fold, it really allows us to better understand how well our security investments are doing, the security spend that we put into products, the security spend that we put into research and development to identify better ways of securing our systems. We're actually able to see if it's working and make adjustments as needed. We're not stuck in this idea of, well, the industry says that a web application firewall is the most important thing to use. Gartner says that this brand of anti-malware for endpoint security is the best to use. Those are all valid sources of information, but the most critical source is our own metrics and understanding how well those things are performing for us, if we should continue to spend, if we should continue putting resources into something that is demonstrably not working. I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of the value stream platform that we're bringing to the industry at Digital.ai. Obviously, security is an instrumental part, an integral part of the idea of value stream management, the idea of delivering value. Aside from security, what we're also providing, the way I like to really describe it, is a platform that lets us do things right, do things properly when it comes to building a digital product from idea all the way to cash, all the way to presenting that value to the customer. Agile planning, a critical aspect of delivering products in a way that allows us to adjust to what we're seeing with our metric tracking, adjust to what we're hearing in terms of customer feedback and industry feedback. The ability to orchestrate releases and automate deployments is something else that we bring with this platform, which is critical, again, from a metric tracking perspective. We need to understand what's actually happening in our automated orchestration for releases, our automated deployment mechanisms. Are there areas where we can improve, or are we just using those things to push software out and not paying any attention after? Beyond app security, continuous testing is another element of the value stream management platform that we feel is critical. Being able to validate everything from functional testing, performance testing, and even security testing, validating that your apps are properly protected against the risks that we've identified through threat modeling. All of that is possible through continuous testing by having a platform that allows for testing across a comprehensive platform that covers the various operating systems, platforms, types of devices that we need to support, but in an automated fashion. We've been seeing for quite a while now that manual testing for those types of things, operating system and platform capabilities, security validation, those are traditionally very manually intensive forms of testing. There's a lot of automated testing that can deliver bits of insight, but when you really want to identify those core things, security, performance, it's a lot of manual effort. And that's what we're really trying to address today, is providing realistic, pragmatic testing on a continuous basis, just like we're striving to continuously integrate new features, new code, continuously deliver value to customers rather than quarterly or annual releases as we might have done in the past. The overall goal here, and this is something that I haven't really talked about yet in our discussion, but the idea of measuring outcomes is really something that we're striving for with these capabilities in a cohesive, holistic platform, rather than just looking at outputs. Was our deployment successful? Did anything fail in creating the database? Those are just outputs. Rather, using this overall idea of value stream management that I've been talking to you about, we can actually measure outcomes. Has our risk demonstrably decreased? That's very different from, is our vulnerability report showing less critical vulnerabilities today? That's great. That's an effective output of a vulnerability management program. We expect to see a decrease in the number of critical vulnerabilities. But the real metric there, the real core of what we want to know, is it decreasing risk? Is it justifying the investment that we've made in that program or in that product? Measuring outcomes is ultimately the goal of value stream management, so that you can really understand if your efforts are working, if your efforts are actually effective. Now, to go a little bit deeper into the security aspects of our value stream management offering, I've talked about the way digital products in the form of mobile applications and web applications can be attacked by attackers and are attacked by attackers today using reverse engineering and tampering. I warned you ahead of time that I'd be mentioning that quite a bit during this discussion. So that's really where our app security efforts are focused, is making sure that as an organization's digital products are released, they are no longer susceptible to those two mechanisms that can lead to really any type of attack. I'm very intentional in calling these things exposures rather than vulnerabilities. The susceptibility of an application to being reverse engineered or better understood by an attacker, that's not really a vulnerability. That's not something that's directly exploitable. Rather, it's an exposure that, depending on the attacker's skill, the available resources, the attacker's motivation, again, all things that we're going to derive from threat modeling. Depending on all of those things, that application could be a very, very effective vector into an organization's backend systems. The vulnerabilities that potentially extend from that exposure are the ones that are very difficult to enumerate. We know that the app is susceptible to reverse engineering. An attacker can understand how that app calls your backend APIs, what is used as authentication for those APIs, and maybe even the attacker might just lift that information right out of your application and repurpose it for attacks against your backend systems. All of those things are what make apps attractive to attackers today. Some of these attacks are very, very easy to carry out. That's really why I speak to these things as exposures, because the potential vulnerabilities stemming from reverse engineering are unknown unless we spend a lot of time with things like penetration testing and really targeted, focused security testing, which is difficult, it's expensive, it's also very, very hard to staff. We know that the skills shortage in cybersecurity is particularly relevant there in terms of what we would typically call ethical hackers, those that have spent decades looking at systems and software and understanding how to exploit these vulnerabilities that in many cases we don't even see when we push these digital products out, when we push a new function or feature out to our website, our web application. A lot of times we're not even aware of the vulnerabilities that are being pushed out. It's a clear gap, again, in the visibility that we need into determining if our security program is effective. But that's really what we are trying to address, is filling that gap and bringing these exposures in to a better understanding of risk so that we can choose the right investments and properly understand if we are demonstrating a reduction in risk as we push these things out. I also just want to comment very quickly, the Digital.ai application security organization actually came from a company previously called Arcsan, which is how I came to join Digital.ai through that acquisition. And traditionally, Arcsan has been the market leading application protection, application security provider when it comes to the types of challenges that we've discussed today. I wanted to just speak a little bit to the trust that we've achieved globally with enterprises across all industry verticals that are relying on our technology, not only to keep their software safe and secure, but to properly measure and understand how that software is secure, how the security is improving over time as we put more into it, how the risks are decreasing over time. I've mentioned a few of the industry verticals that we work in. Gaming is a very large one for us. And the interesting thing about the gaming industry is it's where we see the largest volume typically of very targeted, very skilled attack campaigns. Cracking games, finding ways to cheat, finding ways to defraud the gaming companies by exploiting in-app purchases. It's a huge industry with a huge amount of risk, and by virtue of the fact that they're using our technology to address those risks, it really speaks volumes in my mind to the effectiveness of our security technology. Keeping games from being cracked, keeping cheaters out of games, unable to cheat, is a very, very difficult thing to do. And while it's not necessarily an accurate measure of risk when we look at something like connected healthcare, it's still very much indicative of the types of attacks that we expect to see against those other industry verticals. So overall, what I'm really trying to say is we have a lot of organizations that trust us to protect their most valuable assets, in many cases, even their core intellectual property. So with that, I thank you very much. Charlene, I'll turn it back over to you. I don't know if we have any questions that have come in, but I'm happy to answer any questions that have.
We have gotten some great questions in, and I encourage the audience to keep sending them in because I have a feeling we're going to have a very spirited question and answer period here. We have our first question from Jesse, who says, I would love to see how to get from idealization to criteria/output and examples or stories. How could I make a program to ensure metrics are met, but more importantly, that the mission/vision is met?
That is a great question.
Yeah.
I'll take it. I'll take it kind of one piece at a time. So, in terms of kind of a story representation of that, I would say that really any organization in the midst of digital transformation, the story is often the same. There are unique characteristics, but we've seen a need in the market. We want to bring this product to the market. We build it, we release it. That's the traditional story. Where we find that kind of falls apart is, again, in that lack of visibility. And this is to kind of the second part of your question, is establishing a program that brings about the right visibility so that we can better understand and enhance that story. Not just that we've delivered the value to the customer, but we're also, through continuous feedback, understanding how that value persists for the customer, particularly when it comes to not introducing risk for their organization through the use of our digital product. As far as how we set that program up, that's probably a bigger discussion, and I'd be happy to have that discussion offline. But overall, it really does come down to a few things that I mentioned a number of times. Threat modeling, not just from a security perspective, but from a value delivery perspective. We have to understand the risks that are in front of us. If we look at the tragedy that unfolded in Texas over the last couple of weeks, that wasn't a cybersecurity attack, but it is something that would have definitely been identified in an effective threat modeling exercise. When we look at risk, which loosely translates to likelihood and impact, we look at that, and maybe the likelihood of freezing temperatures taking out a power grid was pretty low, but the impact of something like that is huge, which means that risk is very, very high. It's a critical risk. Threat modeling would have enumerated and weather events and so-called act of God as one of the threats against our system, and we would have been much better prepared to address it. The same thing really applies with what we're talking about here. I hope that answers your question in part and makes sense, and I'm happy to follow up offline.
All right, great. Yes, Jesse, if that doesn't fully answer your question, please know, and everybody who's listening in today, please know that the folks at Digital.ai are getting a copy of all of the questions that came in. So if we don't get to your question, or if you need further clarification, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. Our next question here for you, Paul, is from Mike. He asks, after SolarWinds, there are many questions about trusting the software tools and tool chains for DevOps. It goes into trust of the tools we use for security. Isn't the only thing we can trust is our diligence that we've acted to secure our systems? And don't we need a diversity of security tools so we aren't trusting one supplier? Interesting thought.
Yeah, it is. That brings to mind quite a few interesting challenges. The idea of security tools and vendors are often included in this discussion, and the idea of sort of diversifying defenses to have a more layered approach to security and security through diversity. I think those are all relevant to what we're talking about, what we're trying to achieve with value stream management and securing value stream management. But it also comes down to, and I'll go back again to the idea of threat modeling. understanding risks and choosing the tools that are most appropriate based on the deep understanding of risk. And in many cases, that may involve, going with the same vendor for multiple security controls. I think it's very case dependent, and that determination, it needs to be sort of fed by a lot of other sources of information.
All right. All right. Well, we have plenty of questions here, but there's still time, guys. If you have a question for Paul, go ahead and use your question and answer tab, or you can just throw it in the chat and we'll move it over for you. No problem there. Next question here is from Jamal, who asks, how do we reconcile the shift left approach to security and DevOps with security testing as a function of the commercialization process?
That is a great question as well.
I'm telling you, they're all good questions.
So let's break that down. I'm glad you mentioned shift left. It's not a phrase that I used, but shift left, the idea of security as code, it falls very much in line with some of the other as code things that we've seen. Infrastructure is an important one. And really what it comes down to is the idea of, agile mentality, value stream management, and tracking the flow of value through an organization's delivery mechanisms, bringing as much of the security necessities left into sort of the developer, the DevOps arena, versus our traditional approach where we build the product, we test it, and then we send it to a security group to do an assessment, and we wait for their report, and then have 2 to 3 weeks of sort of round and round tackling the items on the report. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the process that I'm speaking to. So that's where shift left comes into play. With infrastructure, it's something that we can use now as part of the code of the application to get the right infrastructure, the right systems in place for our application deployment. The same thing applies to security. It becomes part of the code to properly secure the application in the manner that we've talked about today, against reverse engineering, tampering. The other element, though, as Jamal mentioned, testing. So that's why we are bringing a continuous testing aspect to this platform, and why we think it's so critical. It's another area where we can capitalize on shifting left and have security testing as part of the code for the application as a whole. It's not something that we're relying on a completely different team to spend time manually testing. By taking that shift left approach and having the security team looking at the same information that the developers are looking at, we can take a much more collaborative approach to securing those value streams.
All right. Excuse me. All right, next question here. Aniset asks, hi, how can we establish a good risk profile?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I'll speak to some of the general ideas that I would recommend. I mean, the first thing in terms of a good risk profile is understanding what good risk profile means to your organization and enumerating the various risks that you have to address to achieve your idea of good. Industry metrics can be helpful in sort of a comparative analysis to determine how we're doing against the industry average. But that industry average doesn't take into account a lot of the variations in organizations, the verticals that we work in, the functionality and services that we provide to a customer. So it really is unique to each organization to understand what a good risk profile is, carrying out exercises like threat modeling to enumerate those risks, enumerate threats and threat agents. That's really the basis of how bringing all that together and then building a plan to manage those risks. That's really the basis of establishing a good risk profile.
All right, excellent. So we are about 11 minutes to the top of the hour, 10 minutes to the top of the hour. There is still time for a couple more questions. If you do have one, just go ahead and use the Q&A tab there in your interface, And we'll just keep going until we don't have any more. So here's another one for you from Jamal. He says, I think there are two separate issues here: vulnerability management and security as a discipline in the dev team. I guess thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, Jamal, you're correct. In fact, this idea can really stem into even more issues than that. But vulnerability management is definitely important. It's a critical function in determining areas of risk. But of course, there are other areas of risk that we need to be able to effectively measure as well. You mentioned security as a discipline in the dev team, and I didn't talk a lot about that, but it is relevant and interesting to point out. I think one of the areas where we struggle with application security still is that our traditional computer science and sort of coding education programs, undergraduate degrees, et cetera, we're still really not teaching the fundamentals of software security to up-and-coming coders, which you can see where that could be challenging and where that could cause problems. In a lot of cases, developers of all levels of experience, entry level, even very senior level developers, may come into an organization that is very much security centric and security minded and be blown away by some of the things that they see in, say, like their coding standards for secure coding and quality coding. And that's just simply because traditionally we don't learn about those things when we're learning about how to build software. We even see today that, a lot of modern computer science programs are even moving away from teaching C and C++ coding, which I think is a huge mistake, given how it works, the nature of that language and that platform. I think it's a fundamental element of understanding how software works, which of course is core to securing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that one. Okay, so next question here. I've seen in the past that KPIs and CISO creates unachievable metrics. Do you have suggestions on how to address this?
Yes, thanks, Jesse. That's quite an accurate statement. I've had similar experiences, and I think the reason that happens and how we can address it is that, if we have a siloed security organization that's largely driven by the CISO, we have a big challenge with visibility. The CISO is going to be managing that hierarchy under him or her. So there's not going to be a lot of cohesion with operations, with research and development, engineering. And so I think that's the core problem, is that if we have a single vertical or even a single person creating those KPIs, they're just not going to be informed. Particularly, if you recall earlier in the slide deck, I listed a handful of KPIs that we should be tracking from a security perspective, but that's just a few examples of many that would depend upon what your organization specifically is doing. But to your point directly, I think everything that we've talked about, from breaking down these silos by adopting a DevSecOps mentality, bringing the idea of security, particularly application security, much closer to building of the application as opposed to a siloed organization that thinks only about security. If we can achieve those things, we can start bringing the proper data and information upward to that CISO or top level of management to choose KPIs in a more informed manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jesse also kind of brings out that doing it this way actually associates to either the CISO or cybersecurity inconsistencies in metrics. So yeah, I guess there's really no kind of perfect way of measuring, other than how whether your organization is vulnerable to a breach right then, right there. So there's a lot of inconsistencies when it comes to using KPIs and things like that. So great questions
Definitely.
that have come in so far. And like I said before, we've got time. Those are all the questions that have come in, but we do have another minute or two if anybody's got any last minute questions they want to send in. And while we're waiting to see if we do get any more, I just want to remind the audience one more time that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. We are going to be sending out an email after today's event that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the Security Boulevard website, so you can go look for it there. You can just go to Security Boulevard /webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Well, it looks like we're not getting any more questions in. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the question and answer period. We had some amazing questions. I was so impressed with the quality of the questions that came in. So I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. And as I said before, if you do have a last minute question, you can go ahead and get it in. Even if we don't use it or speak to it during the webinar here, the folks at Digital.ai are getting a copy of all of the questions that came in, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. Okay, also, I mentioned at the top of the hour that we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do that. Our first winner today is Jesse W. Congratulations, Jesse. Our second winner today is Patrick Q. Congratulations, Patrick. Our third winner today is Rob V. Congratulations, Rob. And our final winner today is Kevin R. Congratulations, Kevin. We'll be following up with all 4 of you offline by email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see it there, please check your spam folder. Paul, what a great presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving such a jam-packed, information-packed presentation. Really do appreciate it.
My pleasure. I hope it was helpful to everyone. And again, I very much apologize for the phone drops.
Oh, well, I think in the grand scheme of things, if that's the worst that happened today, you've got a good day going for you. So again, I appreciate your time and your expertise. And I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm now signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.